No, this meeting is being recorded and there is a transcription going as well. So if you do not wish to be in a recording, please make sure to turn off your camera and don't turn on your microphone, and make sure that if you are in the chat, that could also be read, as this is being recorded for other students who can't make it here today. So just as a thing, and if that's something you would wish not to do, make sure just to turn all of that off. Thank you so much for being here. We're really, I think, excited about these presentations today. This is called Vietnam at 50, War, Memory, and Refuge. And as many of you know, this is the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. And so we are going to be looking at a lot of the different cultural aspects of that. And we have a lot of great speakers today who are going to be delving into these different issues. And I'm excited to hear these dynamic presentations from members of the history department here at Tarrant County Connect. Our first speaker today is Dr. Jason Frawley, who earned his PhD in history from Texas Christian University and has been a faculty member at Tarrant County College since 2005. He currently serves as professor of history and received the Chancellor's Award for exemplary teaching in 2021. In addition to his work at TCC, he has held appointments at Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania, where he was the Thomas W. Smith Postdoctoral Fellow, and at Shepherd University in West Virginia, where he served as the George M. Nethkin Memorial Fellow, and was recently, this last week, a winner of our National Distance Learning Week Faculty Award. So congrats. I need to update your bio for that, Dr. Frawley. So thank you for this presentation today, and we are looking forward to this first talk. And just to let you know, we'll introduce each speaker right before and give you the bio right before each of them speak. If anybody has a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. I feel like this could be fairly interactive, I guess, if you do want to raise your hand, but if not, we will go through these questions at the end of all of the different speakers. Thank you so much today. Make sure that you are on mute if you're in the audience, and we look forward to hearing first from Dr. Frawley.
All right, thanks, Chloe, for inviting me to speak at this event. We do have a lot of speakers, if memory serves. I think it's 6 or 7. So I'm going to try to keep my comments brief. I'm here to just lay the groundwork for the fall of Saigon and sort of the Vietnam conflict in general. So the Vietnam conflict was an outgrowth of the Cold War. The Cold War was a diplomatic contest that lasted from roughly 1945 until 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the Cold War was defined by a game, sort of a game theory that we might call brinksmanship. And it was sort of the free West, the capitalist West, led by the United States, sort of jockeying for position in the world in the post-World War II era. And the communist bloc led by the Soviet Union. And so both sides were trying to again, gain position in the world, and they were pushing each other to the brink. So it was a lot of diplomatic contests, a lot of espionage, a lot of backroom deals, those kinds of things, because the fear was that over the brink, if we go that far, would be nuclear holocaust. But on occasion, the Cold War did turn hot. And the two major occasions for that were the Korean War, which lasted from 1950 until 1953, though technically we're still there. And then, of course, the conflict we're discussing today, which is the Vietnam conflict, which lasted from the U.S. perspective from 1955 until 1975. Now, the Vietnam conflict, or Vietnam in general, Vietnamese history is extremely complex. So for our students out there who are struggling as we approach the end of fall semester in your U.S. history courses, I assure you that there are other places where things are just beyond complex and will truly make your head spin. And so from the Vietnamese perspective, what we call the Vietnam conflict was the second of 3 major Indochina wars. And so there's the first Indochina war against the French, and then the second Indochina war is the Vietnam conflict, which I'll be talking about, and then there would be a third Indochina war afterwards that would actually be a series of conflicts against China, Cambodia, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very, very complex history. So the United States considers the beginning of the Second Indochina War, what we call the Vietnam conflict, to be November 1st, 1955. And this conflict is, again, an outgrowth of the Cold War, and it's also an outgrowth of an ongoing contest between the North Vietnamese, or as you see on the screen here, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which was led by Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist, but also a nationalist. He had, back under French rule, had established what was known as the Viet Minh, which was an organization that was dedicated to reunifying North and South Vietnam. under sort of communist leadership. And the army of the North Vietnamese is the People's Army of Vietnam, and they also have a group known as the Viet Cong, which were sort of the pro-communist, pro-Viet Minh groups in South Vietnam that were sort of the insurgents operating in South Vietnam. And the North Vietnamese had the support of the Soviets and the Chinese. South Vietnam initially had the support of the French, but the French are ousted in 1954 after being defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And what were called the Geneva Accords. The Geneva Accords are going to partition officially Vietnam into two groups, North and South. The North was willing to accept that partition because they were being pressured by their Soviet and Chinese allies who did not want to risk another direct confrontation with the United States right on the heels of the Korean conflict. And they also thought that the upcoming elections in 1956, I believe it was, would peacefully reunify the entire country. Meanwhile, South Vietnam, or the Republic of Vietnam, is supported by the United States, and they have the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And so as you see here at the bottom, we have 6 U.S. presidents that are going to be involved in the Vietnam conflict. The first 2, actually the first 3, it's relatively minor. I think certainly the first 2, we have Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. And so under Truman and Eisenhower, the United States is going to establish its Cold War policy known as containment. And it was the belief that in order to defeat communism, you did not need to actively go destroy it. You could just isolate it, contain it, and because it was a system they believed would not work, it would destroy itself. It would wither on the vine and die out. And so we see Harry Truman issue the Truman Doctrine, which is the policy of containment. We see Dwight Eisenhower advocating for what he called the domino principle, which was the idea that if one country falls to communism, the surrounding countries will fall as well. And you see that quote at the bottom of the screen from Senator John F. Kennedy, who said Burma, Thailand, India, Japan, the Philippines, and obviously Laos and Cambodia are among those whose security would be threatened if the red tide of communism overflowed into Vietnam. And so the United States under Truman and Eisenhower begins its commitment to protecting South Vietnam from a North Vietnamese takeover, and they do so by sending advisors and financial aid. They do not put boots on the ground as far as soldiers. Then under John F. Kennedy, things escalate a bit further. Kennedy's dealing with a lot of Cold War issues, from the Bay of Pigs invasion to the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Vienna Conference, the building of the Berlin Wall. There's lots going on, and he is going to stay committed to protecting South Vietnam. He will increase the number of advisors to help South Vietnam fend off the North Vietnamese to about 16,000. Under his administration, they will also start the Strategic Hamlet Program, because they're noticing that the Viet Cong insurgents down in South Vietnam are sort of getting to the rural population. And so they decide we're going to relocate the rural farmers and put them in these sort of fortified villages to try to, quote unquote, protect them from the Viet Cong. It doesn't work. And then the biggest escalation under Kennedy, of course, is the coup to overthrow the Diem regime, which was the leadership of South Vietnam. Kennedy and his administration had very little faith in how they were handling the ongoing conflict between North and South Vietnam. And so they gave essentially tacit permission to some others in South Vietnam to overthrow and to execute the Diem brothers in November of 1963, early November, and of course in late November, Kennedy himself would be assassinated over in Dallas. Then under Johnson and Nixon, that's where we see the greatest escalation. Under President Johnson, there is an incident called the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August of 1964, where 2 U.S. destroyers are allegedly, we don't have time to go into that part, but allegedly attacked by some Vietnamese gunboats. Congress then gives Johnson a blank check called the Tonkin Resolution to deal with North Vietnam. And so under Johnson, we will see the escalation of bombing runs under what is called Operation Rolling Thunder. And we'll also see boots on the ground. On March 8th, 1965, the first U.S. Marines, 3,500 Marines, are landed at Da Nang, which is a major port in South Vietnam on the northern end of South Vietnam. And by the end of 1965, there will be about 200,000 American soldiers in South Vietnam to try and help them fend off the North Vietnamese. If you've ever seen the film We Were Soldiers Once and Young, or read the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young, the film stars Mel Gibson. That is about the first major battle between U.S. forces and North Vietnamese forces at the Battle of Ia Drang in November of 1965. And as things are escalating under Johnson, we have the big moment is the Tet Offensive, beginning in January of 1968. The North Vietnamese launch a major offensive against South Vietnam. It is militarily defeated on a sort of tactical level, but it changes the hearts and minds here in the United States. Support for the war, tanks as a result. The most trusted man in America, Walter Cronkite, goes on television and famously says, "I thought we were winning this damn war." Lyndon Johnson is going to withdraw from the presidential race in 1968 to try and deal with what's going on both at home and abroad. And so things are certainly escalating, and they're not going in the direction that the United States had hoped. And then we get to Richard Nixon. Nixon is going to adopt sort of a two-pronged policy in South with regards to the Vietnam War. He is going to advocate for what is called Vietnamization. The decision is, you know what, the Vietnamese should be fighting this war. The South Vietnamese should be fighting on the front lines. He's going to start pulling American troops out to the coast to protect ports. He is going to start withdrawing soldiers from South Vietnam under pressure, obviously political pressure here at home, lots of protests, lots of things going on. And so we're sort of slowly turning the war over to the South Vietnamese. We are still going to help with air power. For example, when the North Vietnamese launched the Easter offensives, Nixon will institute Operation Linebacker, which is a major bombing campaign to stop the North Vietnamese. He will also go into Laos, neighboring Laos and Cambodia, which that is going to get a lot of attention here in the States as sort of an unnecessary escalation in the eyes of many. But there are concerns that Cambodia and Laos are prone to communist takeover as well. And so, Nixon, he's again partly trying to pull the troops out, but also kind of staying half in with the bombing campaigns and then jumping into Laos and Cambodia. But finally, in January of 1973, we're going to sign the Paris Peace Accords to, again, start formally pulling out the troops. And by March of 73, almost all U.S. ground forces will be pulled out. Of course, North Vietnam is going to see this as their opportunity, and they're going to launch their sort of full-scale invasion. And you throw all in the middle of this, of course, you have the Watergate scandal and Nixon's resignation. And so the final president here, Gerald Ford, is going to inherit this mess. And so we have the collapse of South Vietnam. I mentioned the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. As I said, North Vietnam is going to sense their opportunity. In 1975, they're going to launch the Spring Offensive. Oh, sorry. Is going to launch the spring offensives, or excuse me, North Vietnam is going to launch the spring offensives in 1975. And as you can see from the map here, they're going to drive right down the peninsula. They're going to conquer the Central Highlands by March 18th. They're going to conquer the ancient imperial capital of Vietnam at Hue on March 25th. They're going to conquer Da Nang March 28th. And they're going to be all the way down near Saigon at Swan Lock by April 20th and have Saigon, which you can see on the map here, indicated by the blue star, completely surrounded by April 27th. About 100,000 North Vietnamese soldiers up against about 60,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, completely demoralized, completely surrounded. And, in March and April of 1975, in Saigon itself, which had seen very little of the war up to this point had directly impacted Saigon, but there were growing fears of communist reprisals. Earlier in the war, when the North Vietnamese had briefly occupied Hue and the South Vietnamese, with U.S. support, had reconquered it, they had found mass graves of sort of the South Vietnamese supporters and whatnot. And so there were a lot of concerns about what might happen when Saigon fell. It's pretty obvious at this point, it's going down. And so starting in March, we start to see fixed-wing aircraft being used to fly out American personnel to places like the Philippines, Guam, and whatnot. But that is going to continue to escalate into April, with the fall of Saigon and what we call the Vietnamese diaspora. So again, Gerald Ford is president at this time. On April 3rd, he is going to institute Operation Baby Lift, which you can see in the bottom left photograph, one of the airplanes carrying these Vietnamese children. But Operation Baby Lift is going to evacuate somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 to 3,000 Vietnamese children, many of them believed to be orphans, though there's some controversy about that later as well. But they're going to sort of be evacuated, relocated, essentially all over the world, many of them coming directly to the United States. Later that month, on April 23rd, we're going to have the big move, which is Operation New Life, which is, again, using fixed-wing aircraft to fly refugees, again, South Vietnamese supporters. And keep in mind, by the way, a lot of Americans had common law Vietnamese wives. They had Vietnamese children by this point, and they're not leaving without their wives and children. And so with Operation New Life, you're going to see these dependents. You're also going to see South Vietnamese political leaders, military leaders, and people who we had been there to support. But we're going to fly them out to Guam. Many of the other neighboring nations were unwilling to accept them because they thought they'd stay. But about 112,000 evacuees are going to be taken to Guam, and they're going to live in tent cities there while they're sort of dispersed again to different parts of the world, most of them coming to the United States, but some going to places like Australia. As you see here, about 1,600 of them actually get repatriated back to Vietnam at their request. There's a ship that they're given and allowed to go back to Vietnam. But this program is going to end in November of 1975. And then probably the most famous of the evacuations is Operation Frequent Wind at the very end of April, April 29th and 30th, which is the official fall of Saigon that we're commemorating today. And here we have Gerald Ford authorizing the United States Naval Task Force 76, which was part of the 7th Fleet, to rapidly evacuate all remaining personnel. And so over the course of these 2 days, they're going to evacuate about 7,000 further refugees and evacuees by helicopter. It's the largest helicopter evacuation in human history. As you can see from the photograph in the middle at the bottom, well, at the top too, that photograph at the top is kind of the iconic image of the fall of Saigon. It's often mismarked as the embassy, but that is not the embassy. That's an apartment building nearby. But you can see people getting on the Huey there, and then you can see at the bottom middle picture, they're literally pushing helicopters off of the decks of aircraft carriers because they're trying to get people on board so quickly. They also had helicopters ditching out at sea after they would drop off the refugees and the evacuees. And then finally, at 7:53 a.m. on April 30th, the final U.S. Marines are going to depart Saigon, and Saigon has officially fallen, and the Vietnam War is over. Estimates are that over the course of these 3 major evacuations, about 140,000 folks were evacuated from South Vietnam. And if you add those numbers up, you might think that doesn't add, those numbers you give us there don't add up to 140, but there were also self-evacuations, as you can see in the bottom right picture, some South Vietnamese on a boat, sort of evacuating themselves, trying to get out. And these self-evacuations would continue. You may see these groups referred to as the Vietnamese boat people. But between 1975 and 1995, and I know we're going to have presentations on some of these later, we're going to see over 800,000 South Vietnamese are going to sort of self-evacuate to get out from under, again, the communist regime that is now in control of all Vietnam, but also to escape those the wars that constituted the Third Indochina War that I mentioned before. So again, that's sort of a bird's eye view of what's going on at this time. And I'm not sure who is, actually, we can change the thing. We'll turn it over. Oh, okay, it looks like Dr. Lundberg is next.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frawley. Okay, the next speaker we have today is Dr. John Lundberg, who is a professor of history here at Tarrant County College Connect. He holds a PhD in 19th century history, U.S. history from Texas Christian University. His teaching career spans 2 decades, and he's authored several books, including the most recent one, The Texas Low Country, Slavery and Freedom on the Gulf Coast, 1822 to 1895, from Texas A&M University Press in 2024, which has won several awards now. Thank you, Dr. Lundberg.
Thank you, Dr. Northrop. If I could remember how to operate Microsoft Teams, that would be great. Here we go. Thank you. So my presentation today is going to focus on the way that the view that scholars have, historians have had of the conflict in Vietnam. And as Dr. Frawley pointed out, this is the second of several Indo-Chinese wars. And so the particular conflict here, of course, is 1954, 55, depending. I guess I always think about the fall of Dien Bien Phu as the beginning of U.S. involvement, but 1955 to 1975. And so historiography, of course, is the history of what historians have written. And it's important to understanding how scholars view the war. And there was the Orthodox school. Early accounts written during or soon after the war that portrayed U.S. involvement as a tragic mistake, a quagmire driven by Cold War hubris, anti-communist paranoia, flawed containment policy. Journalists like David Halberstam framed it as an unwinnable civil war where the United States backed a corrupt South Vietnamese regime. And so that was sort of the Orthodox school of the 1960s and 70s. And honestly, that's a great deal of what, as a scholar and on an individual level, I grew up learning about, or the interpretation that I grew up with, considering that my parents both grew up in the midst of the Vietnam War. Neither of them served, but certainly their contemporaries did. Um, okay, so and secondly, you had the revisionist school of thought. That was the 1980s and 90s. It was influenced by Reagan era patriotism. It portrayed Vietnam as a noble cause. The historians argued the war was winnable, but lost due to media bias, political micromanagement, and lack of public support. Works written during that time period tended to emphasize military successes and critiqued anti-war protests for undermining the effort. And then finally, you have the post-revisionist or contemporary school of thought from the 2000s to the present, influenced by the opening of Vietnamese, Soviet, and Chinese archives that has enabled a more nuanced, multi-sided view. Historians now highlight Vietnamese agency, international dimensions such as the participation of China and the Soviet Union, and of course the war's complexity rather than simple blame. The 2017 Ken Burns PBS documentary exemplified this new, more balanced approach, more nuanced approach. And of course, here at the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, scholars have stressed Vietnam holds lessons for later conflicts, such as Iraq and Afghanistan, and have called for integrating Vietnamese perspectives more into the conversation. Now, as the view of scholars has evolved, public opinion and pop culture have remained relatively steady since at least since the late 1970s and 1980s. The dominant view today is of academic history as a nuanced, multi-sided analysis. Public opinion and pop culture tend to emphasize the idea of a persistent mistake. And of course, today, public opinion and pop culture tends to focus on personal trauma, as well as the treatment of veterans, whereas academic historians tend to focus on the agency of Vietnamese in the conflict in a global context. And as of the 50th anniversary, as of this year, academics have turned to reflective scholarship, while public opinion is also largely emphasized commemorative memories, but somber memories. And we talked about the three historiographical schools. And the evolution of those schools. And again, a lot of this deals with as records have become more available from the opening of the Soviet archives after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the opening of Vietnamese archives as well, and some limited Chinese archives. And so the Orthodox school has a journalistic foundation, as Dr. Frawley pointed out. Walter Cronkite, David Halberstam, they certainly influenced a lot of that early narrative that emphasized moral and strategic failures of American leadership, that emphasized the idea of an unwinnable civil war. And then, of course, you had the revisionist school that was emphasized more by the Reagan Revolution in the United States in the 1980s, that highlighted more of a winnable war thesis, and blamed more left-leaning elements for the loss of American public opinion. And the post-revisionist contemporary scholarship from the 2000s to the present, within the context of the Cold War. And I think also that scholars are revisiting other earlier works that were often ignored at the time, like Douglas Pike's Viet Cong, which was published in 1962. But Douglas Pike was a USAID officer stationed in South Vietnam, and he wrote a really good analysis of the National Liberation Front for the liberation of South Vietnam, more commonly known as the Viet Cong by American forces. But I'm not sure how much anyone in the Johnson or Nixon administrations paid much attention to Pike's writing. From what I can tell, not a whole lot at all. And again, public opinion, as of the 50th anniversary, from what I can gather, is that according to an Emerson College Next Star poll as of April of this year, 62% said that the United States should have stayed out of the war. Only 38% said involvement was correct, the correct move to make. And among veterans of the conflict, who unfortunately are becoming fewer and fewer, 46% called it unjustifiable versus 41% who felt the conflict was justifiable. And then there was another survey in April of 2025 where 44% of the public viewed it as unjustified, which is the lowest justification rating among any wars from World War II onward. And at 70% of adults in the United States believe Vietnam veterans were not treated well by the government upon their return. And of course, this mirrors a lot of other pop culture as well, or pop culture mirrors it, whichever way you want to look at it. The dominant pop culture influences are, they're documentaries like Ken Burns, but for the general public, more Apocalypse Now, Platoon, movies like that. That present a very dark picture of U.S. involvement, a very negative. And again, I'm not passing judgment on any of these views because I'm just trying to, that's what those movies conveyed. And from a personal perspective, from the many Vietnam veterans that I have known in my lifetime, many of whom are gone now, the dominant view among them was that they did their duty to their country, and that whether it was justified or not, that many of them felt it unjustified, but some did feel that it was worthwhile. So there is that, just from an anecdotal perspective. I know a fellow historian who was a combat medic. He registered as a conscientious objector during the war, so they made him a combat medic and sent him into combat without a weapon. And his stories are simply hair-raising, and he really has nothing good to say about our involvement in Vietnam. But it seems to me that the attitudes of the veterans often mirror what their attitudes about the war were prior to either volunteering or being drafted, mostly being drafted. And so that tends to influence how they then later viewed their service, in my experience. But Vietnam was sort of the dark lens that my parents' generation viewed the history of the Cold War in large part through. And so that's obviously going to influence public opinion as well. And so, again, you can see here academic historiography. The dominant view today is nuanced, multi-sided analysis, whereas in public opinion and pop culture, it is a persistent mistake, and that is the narrative. And again, that's just a generalizations, but still, that is my presentation. if you want to read more about what the current interpretations of the war are, I would recommend the Cambridge History of the Vietnam War. It's a 3-volume set edited by Wynne, Miller, Preston, and Asseline, published in 2025 by Cambridge University Press. It is lengthy, but it draws on contributions from 75 leading global experts and provides an exhaustive multi-perspective analysis on the war. And so you might want to check that out. Volume 1 is the roots of the conflict. Volume 2 is the deadlock, starting with the overthrow of Ngo Dinh Diem in late 1963. And of course, Volume 3 examines the domestic, regional, international developments that leading to the war's conclusion and aftermath. So with that, and I will say that interpretations of the war have changed dramatically since I was in graduate school. But then again, as Dr. Frawley can attest, that's been quite some time ago. So
Yes,
thank you very much
Dr.
for your time.
Lundberg. Thank you. All right. So this is a really great segue, I feel, into now pop culture. Like that's kind of where you left off. So
I'm going to jump in here and introduce our next speaker, Dr. Chloe Northrup. She is the department chair and professor of history at Tarrant County College. Her recent publications include Flagellating Females, Incense and Insensibility in Plantation Jamaica, which was in Britain and the World. Also, Fashioning Society in 18th Century British Jamaica, which is her book that's been recently published. In fall 2024, she was a guest curator for an exhibit commemorating the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II in Johnson County, Texas. And she is currently working on a new book called Sea Daddy, Shifting Tides of British Naval Celebrity in 18th Century, which is such a fabulous title. I can't stand it.
Thank you.
And it focuses on images and material objects of British naval heroes. Her research and exhibits have been supported by the Paul Mellon Center for British Art, ACLS, Colonial Williamsburg, Humanities Texas, the NEH, and most recently as an American Historical Print Collection Society Fellow at the American Antiquarian Society. So please welcome Dr. Northrup.
Thank you. So now we are kind of like pivoting into how this war is remembered in pop culture. And so for many of us, maybe the way we encountered this conflict was not through a 3-volume Cambridge set, or maybe in a history class, but maybe through pop culture. And perhaps it was through either musicals or books. And so I'm going to cover some today that at first might not actually seem like they have a lot in common because they've come out over the past few decades, but there are some themes that kind of run through them. And for many of you, you might have encountered this yourself. So please either like raise your hand, not raise your hand, but put out like the emoji of a thumbs up, or put in the chat if you have ever seen Miss Saigon or are aware of the story. So this is kind of, at least for many people, one of these times where it goes from being something that was either somebody's personal memory into something that's been on stage. And so for any of you that have seen it, it is, of course, a reimagining of the operatic tale, Madame Butterfly. And so this premiered in London in 1989. And it is this tragic romance between Kim, a young Vietnamese woman, and Chris, an American GI. And this show became a global phenomenon. It's also really controversial. So obviously the music and the emotional power of it, but also it's been criticized more recently for its stereotypes that are present inside in the musical. I think one of the more controversial things was having Jonathan Price being the conductor, who was mixed race, and Jonathan Price is not, even though I did see him at a restaurant once in New York and I wanted to like go up and tell him what a big fan I was, but I definitely left him alone. But I too, like Dr. Bridges, was completely destroyed. I saw it in London for the first time. I saw it in London. I was doing dissertation research, I think in like 2013, and I was sobbing in this stage, and it's London. Nobody's crying, nobody's showing any emotion at all around me. People are looking at me like, what is wrong with this person? But it was very moving for me. And again, this way that people then encounter this is kind of like diverse depending on how you you experienced this. For me, I was very moved by this emotional story, and the stereotypes were probably not quite as present for me in it the first time I saw it. So it is, for many, the criticism that it's centered on Americans' man's trauma rather than the Vietnamese perspectives. However, like the helicopter scene, again, if you've seen this, was a technical marvel, and this literalized America's dramatic exit, while Kim's suicide could for many reinforce the trope of a self-sacrificing Asian woman whose death redeems Western guilt. So in the decades since, Miss Saigon has faced more increasing scrutiny. Asian American artists and scholars, including one that I'll mention in a minute, Viet Thanh Nguyen, have pointed out that while the show moves audiences, it could flatten complex histories, as many, of kind of like things like this could do. And into these like narratives of rescue and tragedy. And for many, they're saying this is how Americans want to remember Vietnam, through love and loss, but not necessarily of how perhaps Vietnamese people remember it. So this musical matters because it reveals how cultural memory can heal and maybe harm at the same time, and how women's bodies can become the terrain on which wars of remembrance can be fought. So that's our first kind of encounter with this. The next one is kind of then flipping this narrative. So for book recommendations, this is then a novel written by a Vietnamese author who came out in 2015. And so this got a lot of traction because it won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction that year. So I remember I had not heard of it, but I saw it pop up as winning the Pulitzer, and I picked it up then. So if Miss Saigon kind of dramatizes the emotional spectacle of Vietnam, this dismantles it. So it begins with the fall of Saigon and follows the communist double agent who then escapes to the United States. And so the narrator's divided identity, half French, half Vietnamese, kind of shows this divided consciousness that was present in the war itself. And I think the brilliance of this and the genius of this book shows how stories about Vietnam are mediated. And we talked about this through perhaps Hollywood. And so there's a sequence in this in which the narrator becomes the consultant for the film that kind of resembles, at least maybe mirrors, the movie Apocalypse Now. So he realizes himself as this consultant that he is, that the Vietnamese people in this fictional movie have no lines. They scream, they die, they never speak. And so in this book, he says, we are meant to be silent, but we are not mute. And so books like The Sympathizer then force readers to confront how like cultural memory is mediated and the power of who gets to tell these stories. And so for many Americans, the idea is that this war could be like a psychological wound. However, for many people who are Vietnamese, it could represent more of a homeland and the shattering of that. And he's saying that both truths can exist simultaneously. And so this book, which is part spy thriller, part psychological, philosophical treatise, turns this into a mirror that could reflect things like empire, ideology, and exile. And this was a very successful novel. It also became an HBO adaptation. So it's marking a turning point from what we see with Miss Saigon, and now the Vietnam story is being told from another side with moral complexity as well. And so this is kind of a segue then into another book that we read on the Northeast campus a few years ago that was called The Best We Could Do. And so this is one that is not fictional out of this group here, but I wanted us to think about how these books and how different generations then can process these ideas about this kind of intergenerational reckoning, if you will. And this is by T. Bui, and it's a graphic memoir. So I don't know if any of you have encountered graphic memoirs in your own kind of research or your own, for your own enjoyment. But I was kind of surprised at a graphic memoir myself. I was like, what is this? But after I read it, I really enjoyed it. And so I don't know if anyone else has had this. I have also, if anyone has ever read Persepolis, that's another graphic memoir that I think ends up being really powerful and moving in a way that I would say surprised me. I was very skeptical at first. And so it's talking about how then this is a refugee story and intergenerational reckoning, like I said, showing through these images that blend intimate family scenes with sweeping historical context. And so The story is told about people fleeing Vietnam as a child with her family and later becoming a mother herself. And so this alternates between the tenderness of memory and the terror of war. And this title itself, The Best We Could Do, speaks about the exhaustion of parents trying to rebuild a world out of trauma. And so unlike Miss Saigon, which dramatizes loss as spectacle, she is kind of telling this as her own testimony. And so it talks about the refugee experience. And I think it's in a way that people can empathize with really beautifully because of this graphic novel. And so it talks about her parents' life before she was born, thinking about then how these different experiences characterize their life and her life as well. And the artistic style is washed in gray and rust and sepia. And it really, I would say, like evokes feelings of memory and forgetting. So it also challenges the assumption that we've talked about in here in this like 50th year thing that the war ends in 1975. So for refugee families, and I think this is something other speakers are going to talk about, the war continues, dislocation, migration, all of these things. And also the tension between remembering and assimilating, which I think a lot of immigrant families have had to reckon with over history. And so, and I think the one question that really spoke to me is that children of refugees might ask is, what did my parents endure so that I could live? And this is really powerful. And I would say I recommend this if this is something that you want to be able to maybe learn more about this whole experience. And the last one I'm going to talk about is the most recent one. And it also, I think, continues this conversation in pop culture. And it's The Women by Kristen Hanna. And full disclosure, this is the first book that my neighborhood book club chose. And I have a troubled relationship with Kristen Hanna. I feel like some of her books I like, and then some of them I end up being like, oh, I can't stand this book. So this is a reimagining of the Vietnam War as well. And this is one that is then centering the experience on a young American Army nurse named Frankie McGrath, who volunteers for service in 1965. And she is going to be one of the 11,000 women who served mostly as nurses. And these stories, a lot of time were overshadowed by combat narratives and male heroism. And so in this story, then, it's talking about women. So readers witness the brutal reality of field hospitals, the relentless tide of wounded soldiers, and the emotional toll of caregiving in the midst of chaos. And see, what makes this book interesting is it also talks then what happens after the war. When Frankie gets home, she expects gratitude and understanding. Instead, she faces silence, disbelief, and hostility. Veterans are scored. Female veterans are told they were never there. And the story of alienation echoes real testimony. Many nurses hid their service records or suffered a lifelong PTSD and isolation. And so in this one kind of haunting scene in it, Frankie visits the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which we're about to talk to next, and running her fingers over the carved names. And she says, then the world remembered the dead, but forgot the women who tried to save them. And so I think that there's a lot of intersections between these different stories. And I am placing them in conversation today, not that they were ever meant to be, but because I enjoyed all four and I just kind of wanted to mention them about how we remember this war and how it is shown both in fiction and in memoir as well. So Miss Saigon is kind of this first wave of remembrance of an emotional storytelling. The Sympathizer, a second wave, more critical, more post-colonial. And The Best We Can Do, this diasporic generation into focus, talking about that, which again, another speaker is going to speak on. And then now turning this lens on gender and healing and women who also bore witness. So I think that these stories are all telling us that this isn't final, that the story isn't final, that there are still stories that can be told and still like this reverberation then as well. And so I am excited to see our next speaker, which I will just segue right into her. And yes, this is our next speaker who is going to be speaking to us about how we remember these wars in a pretty permanent way. And so Dr. Jennifer Bridges is an associate professor of history at Connect and specializes in women's history, Texas, and the Gilded Progressive Era. She received her master's and PhD in history from UNT and currently has a book contract to turn her dissertation into a manuscript with the University of New Mexico Press. Thank you, Dr. Bridges. And also, I think I have to change your slide, so just let me know when the next slide is.
Oh, I was just able to change it, so
I think
can everyone
see it, but no, they cannot.
Oh
Only,
no! Okay,
yes.
well go
So,
ahead. Go ahead.
Let me know. I feel yes.
The first slide, because that means I will have no idea. Okay, everyone. So basically what I'm going to do today is just look at, as Dr. Northrup said, the sort of physical representations of memory that we have for the Vietnam War in this country. And I'm going to look at the one in Washington, D.C., and then I'm going to take a minute at the end and look at what we have closer to home in the Metroplex. Okay. So I actually, in creating this presentation and thinking about it, I was struck with a memory of I've only seen it once, the wall in Washington, D.C., the Vietnam Memorial, and just struck by remembering I was a teenager and how really somber and emotional it was, even though I knew very little about the Vietnam War at the time that I saw it and didn't understand. But as I'm going to talk about when looking at this memorial, it is quite emotional. So we're going to look at the history and legacy of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., which is known as the Wall. And then, as I said, we're going to kind of situate two of the North Texas more local sites in that memory landscape. We're going to look at the Texas Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Dallas and the new developing Tarrant County Vietnam Memorial in Fort Worth, so one that's very local to us. And I'm also going to address a lesser known kind of controversy attached to the Washington, D.C. Memorial, which is an effort by many to leave human remains at the wall, and why ultimately the National Park Service is going to prohibit that. Okay, so you can change the slide. So in 1979, Vietnam veteran Jan Scroggs launched a memorial effort that led to a national design competition. And in 1981, the unanimous winner out of more than 1,400 entries for this was a young woman named Maya Lin. She was 21 years old and she was a Yale architecture student. Her design is very interesting. It cuts into the earth with two polished black granite wings, and they are inscribed, these black granite wings, they're inscribed with the dead and the missing from the Vietnam War, from the Americans, in chronological order. And it's very austere. You can change the slide again. It's a land art form that's really meant to read in a way as a wound that heals. And it was dedicated on November 13th, 1982. And the memorial became one of the most visited sites on the mall in Washington, D.C. And as I said, it's very powerful, right? It's very powerful. And one of the things that makes it so powerful is the reflective aspect of it, right? So with all of those names there, the names of the dead and missing, but when you're standing in front of it, as you can see in this picture, you can see the reflective quality. You see yourself, right, in the names. And that from personal experience, I can say it creates a very emotional connection, honestly, with the dead and the missing. It's very powerful. Now, the Vietnam Memorial in DC, it actually sparked some controversy when it was designed and created. Its color, it's just everything about it. It was not something that everyone was just super excited and agreed upon. Critics of it called it a black gash of shame. Now, Maya Lin, who designed it, she defended the reflective black surface as what I just said, as a literal mirror between the living and the dead, and kind of a way of creating connection, and a very powerful way at that. So, as a compromise to those who were critical of this memorial, you can change the slide. There were a couple of other smaller memorials created. There's a figurative bronze known as the Three Servicemen, and that's the picture on the left, which is created by Frederick Hart in 1984. And then the picture on the right is the Vietnam Women's Memorial, which was created by Glenna Goodacre in 1993. So both of these were added nearby to the Vietnam Memorial. And so it preserved Lin's layout, but also answered the demands for more representational heroism. So these three together kind of compromise, again, the memorial in Washington, D.C. Now, on that reflective black granite original one, there are the names of the more than 58,000 dead or missing. And so again, it's very powerful, right? Because there are so many names. Now, from day one, from the very beginning, right, of this memorial, visitors kind of attempted to interact with these memories. It's to interact with the wall. They would do name rubbings, right, on people, again, their loved ones, or even just to do it. They would do name rubbings, and they would also leave objects. So you can change the slide. They would leave all sorts of objects. They would leave medals, they would leave boots, letters, even helicopter parts, right? These pieces, right, of their loved ones. And the National Park Service, along with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, began to catalog these items. And more than 400,000 of these items have been collected. And it's really an extraordinary grassroots archive, kind of showing grief and reconciliation that's housed in these museum collections. And very powerful stuff. And these offerings really testify, right, to how various communities really appropriated the memorial to process the war's aftermath, right, to deal with their grief in a very kind of tangible way. And the wall's chronology, right, it kind of forces a walk through time. And as I said, that reflective surface, it's very powerful. It returns our gaze, it mingles our self with the names of the dead. And so by offering, right, these memories, these literal physical memory items, it's a way of converting, people's private mourning into public history. So one of the more challenging kind of aspects of this is something that crosses, right, legal lines and conservation lines. And that is that people started to leave cremated remains, cremains as they're called, or even attempt to scatter the ashes of their loved ones at the memorial. And for decades, actually, families kind of quietly did this. This started happening. And at first, the Park Service would just gather these remains and store them with the other left objects. But as the practice increased, which it did, as it increased, the National Park Service had to kind of create a policy about this, and you can change the slide. And the policy was not to do this, right? The policy was that leaving or scattering human remains at the wall would be prohibited moving forward. And you can change the slide once more to see there's signs now, like physical signs saying don't do this. There's signs on site and online that warn that ashes will not become part of the permanent collection. They will not be housed with the other items. And a news report in 2018 said that there were at least 70 instances documented, right, of people leaving cremains. Obviously, in terms of scattering ashes, that number could be much higher because that's a little bit harder to document, right? But in terms of like placed cremains, we have at least 70 documented times we know that that's happened. So again, the rule for this, the controversy with this, it's really about public health, right? And also the preservation of the memorial surface and just the integrity of a national, monument, right? To not do this. But this kind of episode, it sort of reminds us that, commemoration, it's negotiated and it's different for everyone. For some people, this was families seeking a final resting place and some meaning, right, for the final resting place of their loved one. But of course, it's also a showcase of the state enforcing a preservation mandate, because again, this is a national historic monument. So this tension, right? This tension is part of the wall's continuing and evolving story. So let's move a little closer to home and change the slide. And we're going to look at a couple of the examples that we have and are developing here close to us in the Dallas Metroplex. So to begin with, the one we already have, the Texas Vietnam Veterans Memorial, it opened in 1989 in Fair Park in Dallas. It was dedicated by President George H.W. Bush, and it lists 3,415 Texans who died or remain missing. And it kind of has some, connection. It is also granite slabs, but these are pink instead of black. There is a reflecting pool located there as well. And it is kind of, the Friends of the Texas Vietnam Veterans Memorial have stewarded this site for decades. So this is a Texas site in Dallas, and it, again, is kind of a statewide sort of memorial, right? It may be in Dallas, but it has a list of all of the Texas dead and missing on it. Now, slide change. Now, the one that's coming to Tarrant County is a county level memorial. So Tarrant County has not had a permanent county level role of its Vietnam dead and a memorial for them until now. A community effort is building the Tarrant County Vietnam Memorial at Veterans Memorial Park on Camp Bowie Boulevard. And this is all very new. The city just approved the major funding for this in April of this year. And the design aims to name more than 220 local service members who died during the war and to anchor a county remembrance in a public space. So, we've sort of seen the national, we've seen a state level, and this is going to be a county level example of, again, how we remember those that we've lost. And so these sites show how national memory translates locally. Right? Again, Dallas monumentalizes the statewide sacrifice. And then this Fort Worth project is really going to be local names and stories at the county scale. But both of these are in dialogue with the national wall, right? And that template of names and reflection. Slide, please. And so the wall's influence is everywhere. There's also a replica called The Wall That Heals, which is a traveling exhibit. And it really, again, has the names on it, and it continues that legacy. So for teaching, the wall functions as a primary source, right? Its design, its controversies, the offerings, policies around it reveal how Americans have argued about the war, have mourned its losses, and have shaped public space to do both. So again, we see this national, state, local levels. So in short, the wall is both minimalist sculpture and also maximalist archive, right? It kind of represents both. And it's a federal monument that's animated by a grassroots ritual because, again, people connect very physically and tangibly with this monument. And in North Texas, the memorials extend that work closer to home. And the debate over human remains underscores the ongoing negotiations, right, between personal grief and public stewardship. And that is a negotiation that is continuing to keep these memorials alive. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next speaker today is Professor Stacy Bryant, who's an instructor of history here at TCC Connect and a proud graduate of Tarrant County College. She earned her bachelor's of arts in communication from Tarleton State University and a master's of arts in history from Wayland Baptist University. Currently, she's pursuing a doctorate at Southern Methodist University, where her dissertation investigates how the historical institutions of slavery and exploitation established the structural foundations for contemporary human trafficking. And today, she's going to speak on the U.S. refugee resettlement program after Vietnam. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to speak very briefly about the processes and policies that changed as a result of Vietnam and how these policy changes still continue to support people today. So if you could change the slide, please. Our refugee resettlement program in the United States started after World War II. And in its early years, there was no national infrastructure, no real documentation or definitions about who qualified as a refugee. So whenever there was an international crisis and people who needed to be resettled as refugees, we would create these temporary ad hoc laws to raise the immigration ceiling limit so more people could come. And this typically prioritized people fleeing communism and Cold War refugees. Next slide. All right, so after Operation Frequent Wind, there were about 130,000 evacuees wanting to enter the United States. And so President Gerald Ford signed the 1975 Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act into law. So what this did was it gave people formal recognition and protection from Vietnam and Cambodia as refugees. It also added $455 million for resettlement support services. Next slide. Now, people continued to leave Vietnam after this time, and a lot of people, it was about between 350,000 to 400,000 people left Vietnam in the following years. A lot of those people took very dangerous boat and ship trips to neighboring countries, and it wasn't really a safe process for them. So the United Nations stepped in and created the first long-term international refugee pipeline when they created Orderly Departure Program. So this created a safe route for people to immigrate out of Vietnam, and the United States received 458,000 people through this program. Next slide. The following year, Jimmy Carter signed the Refugee Act of 1980 into law, which was a really big one for the United States. So what we did and what this law did was it redefined, or it created a definition for who qualifies for refugee services that aligns with the United Nations. It also raised the annual admission ceiling from 17,500 to 50,000. It established the Office of Refugee Resettlement and created a nationwide framework that replaced these temporary ad hoc laws and policies. Next slide. So that led to several major developments. So we started to see federal and state refugee offices. We also saw the development of partnerships between governments and nonprofit organizations, as well as faith-based organizations that are offering services to refugees. Next slide. So these increased cooperation and services is increased federal funding. So we offer English language classes and job training. There are specialized foster care programs, growth of trauma support services, and also support in integrating into their new lives. So these policies that have changed since 1975 have supported over 3 million refugees arriving in the United States. And I will go ahead and turn it over.
Thank you so much, Professor Bryant. That's fascinating about the history of resettlement and all of that. That's really interesting. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Carrie Zachary, who is an instructor of history at Tarrant County College Connect campus. She completed her undergraduate studies in education and history at Baylor and her graduate studies in history and writing at Western New Mexico University and online education at Southern Hampshire University. Carrie is a forever student as she continues her graduate studies at Southern Hampshire University. After a childhood in Austin, Carrie and her husband have made Fort Worth their home with their 2 school-age children. She enjoys learning all about the past on road trips with her family. Thank you, Carrie, for your talk on Tarrant County today.
Awesome. Thank you. So next slide. Can you see it or you switch it? Okay. Great. So I will bring it back home to Tarrant County, where we are, to talk about the presence of Vietnamese people with a heritage and as well as the remembrance. Some of the topics have been hit on, but I'll give you the Tarrant County point of view. So based on what Professor Brian spoke of, there are many waves of immigration. The main ones from Vietnam to North Texas, 1975, the 1980s, and then the 1990s. That leaves us now with currently about 38,000 Vietnamese residents living in Tarrant County, or about 2% of the population. A fairly recent survey showed that about 30,000 Tarrant County residents speak Vietnamese. So those stats overlap a little bit, making it the 3rd most spoken language. If you see public things like when you go to vote or something on a county level, you will see translations in Vietnam pretty prevalently. Ha Tom City has 3.7%, so a higher percentage than the county of its population as Vietnamese descent, people of Vietnamese descent, which makes it the highest in Tarrant County. You will meet Ha Tom City's mayor in just a second. And the DFW Metroplex has the 2nd largest concentration in the United States. Next slide. Okay, can y'all see that?
It says, please share and chat.
Got it. Perfect. Okay, take a second to share in chat. I love how this group has been actively sharing experiences and asking questions. Do you have an answer to any of these? And the Veterans Memorial that Professor Bridges spoke of is currently it's on Camp Bowie, so not far from the Trinity River campus where they're adding the Vietnam part there. Yeah, it seems like a lot of people have answers. Awesome, and you can continue to share as we move on as well. Yeah, lots of people. So my grandfather served in the military his entire career, but he never talked about it. So I'm learning a lot more about him now. My cousin's daughter just honored him at her Veterans Day presentation at school a few weeks ago. And I think it's so cool that his memory is kind of staying alive. And I'll probably learn from talking to her about her program and presentation. Awesome. Y'all keep sharing. Awesome. Okay, next. Oh, cool. So you visited the one in DC. Yes, I visited the one there as well. All right, so some faces of Tarrant County's South Vietnamese community. The Fort Worth report provides really great local reporting, usually with a focus on people's stories. And I really learn a lot from there and find a lot of things that I can start from and build on. So this introduces you to some leaders in Tarrant County. So we see the Haltom City Mayor right here, Arlington City Council member, a teacher and owner at a restaurant. And this lady was just chosen to open a very large restaurant that will be called Duong Deville or Sweet Street Deville, which is a restaurant and grocery. It'll be out on 820 and will be a big spot that has food and grocery. Maybe we can all do a field trip out there. And then this lady has a store with martial arts focused. So again, people that are really have assimilated, have been in the country a long time, but have a focus on remembering. One more thing I'll add is I found a group called the Vietnamese American Community of Tarrant County and vicinity. And they are a group that does as you would expect. One of their goals was to preserve the Vietnamese cultural values and Vietnamese American heritage. And that is a group that appears to have activities, participate in parades and social events as well. All right, so the most recent Veterans Day Parade had a focus on our veterans from Vietnam due to all the reasons we've talked about today. It was in downtown Fort Worth on November 11th. I know some of you stated you've been to some of the parades before. Here are a few photos. This is the ROTC from TCU. I love this, the submarine veterans. There's some great news coverage on this, and some of the veterans spoke of just that was mentioned in chat, people having a chance to have some pride and recognition that they didn't feel when they first returned. I love this right here, service, valor, and sacrifice. And again, just a good focus on them, which I think builds really well into the memorial. One more thing though, the Grand Marshal was a decorated war veteran named Doug Peterson. He saved hundreds of lives as a dust-off, which is a helicopter pilot for medical evacuations. So I think that's really cool that he was able to serve as the marshal and really have a moment to be honored. So as we build on that, as Dr. Bridges said, it is a new memorial at an existing location. So if you're at the Trinity River campus, it's, kind of over here, and there's this little park. I have passed it millions of times, and I hope we can all be there next November 11th for the dedication. That would be a really cool time to get the history club or history students, people that want to honor this special moment here. A few things I want to point out. This is all information from the Fort Worth City Council Working Group, and it was approved recently, and they're working through getting this done. I like this. I also like the goal right here, to salute the impact of those who served and paid the ultimate sacrifice. I do wonder if there will be sort of a mention or an honor of the women that did serve. I haven't looked close enough because that is fresh in my mind. And I will say that, yeah, now it's approved. They're working on fundraising, construction, and then again, the dedication. And that is all for me. So stay tuned. Again, hopefully in less than a year, we can all visit that, and hopefully meet some of the people that are truly impacted.
I feel like this is a really great segue into our final speaker today, Dr. Karen Wisely, who I hope is here. I feel like I saw you here. I hope you're still here. And Dr. Karen Wisely is going to talk about now. We've seen a lot of people talking in the chat about knowing a Vietnam veteran or somebody perhaps who came from Vietnam. And Dr. Wisely is going to speak now about how you can take oral histories of these individuals, how you can document their stories. And this is really important. Many of you have said, we know somebody who is there and no longer with us. And so I think the time is now to document these stories here. And Dr. Wisely did not send me a bio, so I made this up. This is all true, though. Received her PhD in history from the University of North Texas and has been department chair at the Northeast campus and is now interim dean of human and public services. This picture that I found on the internet from an outrageous oral presentation based on her dissertation research in Dallas on the Dallas Way. Karen owns a cat and also loves movies, and you can hear every other Friday afternoon for movie discussions that the Northeast campus hosts and invites us really kindly to join. And those are on Friday afternoons. And this year is favorite movies, but sometimes there's themes depending on the year. So Dr. Wisely, I hope, are you still with us?
I'm still here, Chloe.
Yay! Okay, good. Yay. So, Dr. Wisely, was that bio okay? Like, tell me if I got anything wrong.
Yeah, that's
okay.
great.
Thanks,
that's great.
Thanks.
I like the movie part. In fact, I was looking at the chat, and there's a lot of questions about movies, and I have a few suggestions. Real quick before I talk about oral history, Forrest Gump, great Vietnam era movie. He manages to cover the gritty parts of the war in a way that is thoughtful but not depressing. There's 1978's Coming Home, about the wife of a Marine serving in Vietnam, played by Jane Fonda. Born on the 4th of July, it's based on the memoir of anti-war activist Ron Kovich, and tells his story, starring Tom Cruise. Full Metal Jacket from 1987 talks more about the military itself rather than the conflict. Platoon, 1986, is starring Charlie Sheen. That's widely viewed as one of the best movies about a war. First Blood, of course. How can we forget Rambo? Sylvester Stallone's character dealing with PTSD and Agent Orange exposure. Casualties of War, starring Michael J. Fox, which talks about the My Lai massacre. Gardens of Stone, which is one that doesn't get a whole lot of attention. It follows the life of a group of soldiers assigned to duty at Arlington National Cemetery, and it talks about like wanting to go to war, but the people who have been to war trying to protect people from going to war. For very old school, 1968, The Green Beret is entirely propaganda and gets most of the facts wrong. but hey, it's John Wayne. 1979, Apocalypse Now. I've seen a lot of discussion about that. The Deer Hunter from 1978 earned 5 Academy Awards, and Good Morning Vietnam from 1987, starring the late great Robin Williams, is a good movie for that too. Now to more important things like oral history. These stories that people have, the people that you know in your life who have been to Vietnam, it's going to be more difficult for you to get them to talk about it, because a lot of these guys don't want to bring it back up. They've worked their whole life to try to not remember it. So you have to kind of go gently when you're doing this. I recommend, that you do talk to them, but you can't just jump right in and ask them that question. So what we do when we're taking oral histories is we do more of a life story, and you start talking about early in your life, the stories that are maybe more pleasant, more like heartfelt, kind of heartwarming things, and develop a rapport. And then when they feel comfortable, and you can talk about what happened, just understand that it might be rough. And a lot of, especially if there are fathers or grandfathers and people like that, they don't want to cry in front of you, but they might. And so you have to be more gentle on that. Everyone, I'm sure in this chat has a recording device with them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is your phone, and you can do a nice recording there, if that is something you want. There are also other places that you can go. A lot of colleges and universities who have oral history programs would love to hear the stories, and might be a little easier for your fathers, your grandfathers, to talk to complete strangers than it is to talk to their relatives. So I highly recommend, though, that you do talk to them and tell them that these are stories that are important, that they're shared. These are stories that are very important, that they are preserved. It is how we learn about things that happened. So I recommend it. You won't regret a conversation that you have with a loved one, but you can and probably will regret not having one. For books, the one that I'm recommending, and I know you can't see that, but it's called Patriots, and it's by a man named Christian Appy, Appy, and it is an oral history collection that he has done with all sorts of different angles on the Vietnam War. He talks to Americans and Vietnamese. He talks to people who were involved in the fighting of the war, and the people peripheral around them, the nurses and doctors and things like that. But he also talks to war protesters at home, and parents who had children fighting in the war, and things of that nature. So he really is trying to get all angles of the war and cover it by talking to the people who were there and who were involved. So I highly recommend this. This was a very enlightening book for me to read when I was in grad school. And it also will help you understand the role of oral histories, because a lot of times when we ask people to tell us their stories, they say, well, I don't remember the facts. I don't remember, I might get something wrong. And that doesn't matter. We can look up the facts. We can correct things in the oral history that are incorrect. But what we can't get from the documents and all of that is the emotion and the the way that it affected the people who were involved in it, and that's why oral histories are very important in the telling of any story, because it adds more depth, it adds more texture to what we're saying, rather than just give you bland, dry facts. So I recommend talking to your relatives and loved ones. And if not, send them my direction. We have a studio here. I'd love to sit down and do an oral history interview with someone that would talk to me. So that's that's all I have to say, Chloe. If that's all you
Yes,
need to
thank
hear
you
from
so
me.
much. Yeah, I just that was such a like really beautifully said, and I agree with what Carrie's saying in the chat here about how this really adds so much depth and for our own understanding of historical periods and our own understanding of history. And I've had students I in 1302 do these kind of things where they interview grandparents or somebody and they talk, and I've had several email me afterwards saying, this person passed away and I'm so glad I have this recording now. And I think that this is like one of those moments that we think about an event like the Vietnam War being like seems like it was so near for some people, but now it's kind of drifting and we're losing so many of these individuals. So it's now, like you said, now is the time to gather these stories. If you have a loved one in your life, feel free to email any of us who would be happy to share resources about recording these oral histories, or just sit down, jot a few questions down and sit down with someone and just say, yeah, tell me about your life. And yeah, let's chat. And maybe that's just a great way to get started. A few things, please. If you are a student here today, we would love for you to join History Club. We need a few more students in order to become a registered student organization. And so we would love for you to be part of that. Please fill out that form, and you don't even have to be an officer. We just need people who are willing to be members. Also, there is the attendance form. I'm going to try to pin it. There we go. I am pinning the attendance form, and I am pinning also the form to join the History Club. If we have a few minutes, if anybody has some questions today, I've seen a lot in the chat, but I feel like some of them have also been answered as we're going on. So many movie suggestions. I actually thought, like, I did not realize perhaps how many movies are about the Vietnam War, or at least invoking it. And yeah, that's really fascinating to think about. If we don't have any other things today or any other announcements, we can. Oh, Professor Richard Miller. Yes. Hi, Richard.
Hey, Chloe. First, I want to say, I want to say thank you for doing this today. Um, it's something that needs to be done. Um, talking about this because it's a topic that, for many, many, many years, and for many people, couldn't. Um, I mean, two things that jumped out. One about talking to veterans and getting their stories. Um, my brother wouldn't talk about anything. And I still remember the night before he got married, his buddy, best man, I forget how it even came up, but something that we as his family didn't know, that right before he came home and the movie Green Beret was brought up, there's a scene where the camp is overrun and it's reduced to hand-to-hand combat. That happened to him. And he never shared it with us. But he would, after he got home, he'd wake up screaming with night terrors. But the other thing too is the Vietnam Memorial um, actually is kind of a almost like a metaphor for how our cultural psyche dealing with things like this has changed. Because prior to that, we would remember the glory, the glamour, the politics, the whatever, and it was the first time that we actually focused on the individuals, the names, and it's become the standard that we've followed since with the Oklahoma City Memorial, the 9/11 Memorial, and others. So it does signify a turning point, and yet yes, when it was conceived at the time, and this was both national news, but me living up there, local news, there was tremendous controversy. And the two things that I remember, one veteran who just was very much an adamant spokesperson against the design, he was very adamant. And yet there was, he couldn't accept it. Whereas there was another who said that, the memorial is such that I can go in and I can remember, and that's all that needs to be done. And that's with your Vietnam veterans, that was always the dilemma. You had those two kind of polar opposite groups that all saw the same thing but came home with different interpretations. And I'm going to stop there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And I think I really love today our focus on the individuals in the different experiences that so many had, whether that is through combat or through families or through displacement or through being the child, the grandchild, the niece, nephew, the family member of someone who served then. It seems to have touched everyone's lives in here in some way, whether that is through fictional representations that you saw that you then had empathy towards people in there through family members. Everyone in here has a story about this as well. And thank you so much for sharing that today. And I'm glad we could remember your brother, Richard, and so many people in here, their family members as well. I'm thinking about my own husband's grandfather who served, and many of you have that same kind of connection. And these people are, I think what Dr. Wisely is reminding us too, these stories are important for us to learn, and keeping that individual focus in the forefront as well. Thank you everyone for being here today. This is a lovely conversation, and I hope I know I learned a lot today, and I hope everyone did as well. Please feel free to look up these resources, look up things about this war, whether that's a documentary or a book, or maybe just listening to some oral histories today, and think about a Vietnam memorial. And let's all mark our calendars, hopefully, to be able to join next year to see the memorial in our own backyard. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and we'll see you all soon for another event here in the History Department. Bye for now.